Last week, September the 23rd, the leader of the most powerful economy in the world told the United Nations that its green agenda and pursuit of migration was destroying Europe. Like him or loathe him, US President Donald Trump bluntly told the UN to get knotted. Is the USA calling it right? I'm Eddie Hobbs. Let's break it down. So I want to welcome to the studio data scientist and author and commentator Ivor Cummins. You've studied what Trump has described as this double-headed monster. So can we we're going to first start with climate change, but let's just have a look at what Trump actually said at the UN. I know you've looked at it, but a lot of our viewers may not have seen it.
It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion. Climate change, no matter what happens, you're involved in that. No more global warming, no more global cooling. All of these predictions made by the United Nations and many others, often for bad reasons, were wrong. They were made by stupid people that have cost their countries fortunes and given those same countries no chance for success. If you don't get away from this green scam, your country is going to fail.
Well, it isn't very interesting. Leave aside how one might personally feel about the leader of the United States of America. You've looked at the whole climate change thing. I know because we had a discussion some years ago when you decided to start looking at it, and you rang me because you were saying, like whatever about the impenetrable side of COVID and the pandemic, this thing was easily cracked open. So what did you see when you went at it?
Yeah, Eddie. Well, I was actually quite surprised because COVID, you referred to there, that had a lot of complexity early on. Like any complex problem, I spent a whole career on them. Early on, it's very hard to work out what's going on. It takes a long time, a lot of data. But when the climate thing exploded after Ukraine, after COVID, climate came along 24/7. So I said, I'd better look into this one. Because now I was really interested in everything geopolitical because of the experience during COVID. So I looked into it, and I say in a few hours I realised, as a complex problem-solving engineer for 4 decades, it only took a few hours to look. And what you do when you want to understand if a hypothesis is correct or not, you do the opposite of what most people do, oddly enough. You look for conflicting data, not the affirming data. And that's the way I ran my whole career. That's why I was successful. So I looked for any conflicting data, and quickly it mounted up. So I did a graph. I did multiple graphs, but you picked one out. We look back in history and we see that cyclically the temperature has gone up and down on planet Earth for millions of years. And there's nothing notable about where we are now. And it's due to Milankovitch cycles, the movement of the Earth through the solar system. So a lot of science. I looked up all that. But there's nothing that actually supports strongly the climate change disaster hypothesis. Climate has always been changing. A good example is, as a refuting point, is that the CO2 that Al Gore showed correlates with the temperature. It's quite convincing in a little zoomed-in graph. But actually the CO2 around 600 to 800 years after the temperature changes, the CO2 follows the temperature changes. And that's because most of the carbon is in the oceans.
Was that graph where there was a big gap in the middle? Yeah, there was a lot of white space, and then you had the temperature movement up on top, and then you had CO2 below. But when you compressed the two lines together, there was a gap of 800 years. So what you're saying there, if I'm reading it correctly, is that the CO2 was following the increase in temperature as opposed to the other way around.
Exactly. It was behind it. So in other words, in root cause or causal chains, the carbon dioxide concentration, the actual temperature change is the cause of that. And we know the mechanism. It's basic physics. So basically, the oceans sequester most of the carbon dioxide. And like anyone knows with a nice beer, if you warm up the beer, the carbon dioxide goes out of it. And if you cool it down, you can put super high carbon dioxide in. It's really fizzy. So the oceans are the same. So it takes hundreds of years. But when the temperature of the Earth moves due to sun activity and Milankovitch cycles and myriad other effects, what happens is the carbon dioxide is let out of the oceans. And because the stores are massive in the ocean, it just lets out some and it changes quite notably in the atmosphere. But the idea that one causes the other backwards is kind of absurd. There's a tiny effect, Arrhenius noted back in the 1800s, a tiny effect But the idea that it's driving the bus is quite frankly absurd.
Now, I find that interesting because I remember at the start of COVID, you were focusing on the Diamond Princess data, and that's what really got you into it. And here you're looking at, you know, what you just described. So I presume that brought you then to, looking at, how did it all come about? How did we end up with UN IPCC models? And what were your findings when you did that?
Right. Well, that's very important, are the origins of any hypothesis. So the pure science is just looking to see is it correct or not, looking at conflicting data, doing evidence for against tables, is not, Kepner-Trago, all that hardcore stuff. But you also, in these geopolitical things, need to look at where they came from. And the best rendition of that story is Dr. Jakob Nordengård, I know you know quite well. He, as a ponytail professor in a climate university in Sweden, back around 15, 16 years ago, was genuinely concerned about climate change, genuinely concerned about peak oil, and he did papers and publications and all that stuff. And he was really worried. So he asked the professors, the dons, the experts, where are the origins? And I want to go deeper in the science. And they only knew climate change back to the IPCC in the 90s. And he could not understand how the experts, their knowledge started in the 1990s. It seemed crazy. So he went, like I would or you would, and he dug. And it only took him a couple of days, and the root cause of where climate change came from went clear as crystal back to Rockefeller Brothers Fund in the 1950s. So he thought, the big oil men, that's who started all this? And they funded the Club of Rome, and they funded myriad organisations. The reason Sweden is such a big...
And the Club of Rome was the early 70s, Ivor, was it? Or was it
1971 or 2, I think. Agnelli funded it. So Agnelli was Italy's richest man, and he was in Chase Manhattan Bank with David Rockefeller, the big Rockefeller, big buddies. Everywhere you look, you get the big oil, big banking, and the likes of Agnelli. And they all work together to fund what they really want is world government. And David Rockefeller said before he died, when he was in his 80s, he said, I've been accused of wanting, a world government essentially under rule. And if so, I stand guilty of that. So he didn't even hide it. But climate change, they realized, because after the advent of nuclear weapons, war could always be used as a major control of, the ants in the ant farm, the masses. But now that was problematic because of nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction. So they looked and brainstormed way back in the 50s and 60s, and they said international terrorism is a global issue. Ecological and climate change, a global issue requiring a global solution, which we will have to give. And they listed out these various opportunities, crises and opportunities.
But did that include pandemics as well, by the way?
It most certainly did.
All right, okay.
So the two big ones, actually, the really big ones, were the climate and global health pandemics being the big thing. Because you don't care about global health, you don't care if half the people in the country are starving. Obviously, these people, they're kind of a bit sociopathic. But they care about global panics and global issues, problem, reaction, solution. So create the panic and then come in with the solution. So climate and pandemics are pretty much, they're just two mechanisms.
So when did it take on then at the UN? Was that in the early 80s that they started to, like the very, very early stages of the discussion around climate change? Well, it was called global warming in those days because we'd come out of a cooling period, if I recall correctly. But what actually happened then? Can you just walk us through that? We're now, as far as everybody's concerned, it's almost presented as a given fact. That the science is complete, settled. The science is settled, which of course is a nonsense because the scientific method is never settled.
Of course.
So how did we end up in a situation where Ireland is committed to Agenda 2030, which is to do with all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is all linked into the same agenda, zero carbon, and we're bolted into it now to try and hit certain targets in 5 years' time, which is why I believe Maria Steen was stopped from becoming a nominee, because we didn't want to have an independent barrister in there, getting in the way of the sort of pipeline of legislation that's coming through. But we're now in a situation where the most powerful leader in the world, representing the largest economy with all of its resources, has walked into the very chamber that have created all of these models and said it's a hoax. Is he overstating?
Yeah, I mean, it's fun to watch. And of course, all the legacy media and the usual propagandists came out and just say, oh, it's the orange man, yada, 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 which is getting quite tiresome. But no, he's broadly correct there. I mean, that's the reality. I'm not saying he's correct on everything, but he's certainly correct on that. To the history, which is worth briefly checking in on. So remember the United Nations, Rockefeller and co. Donated the land in New York and funded it. They had tried the League of Nations, the big banking families in the early 1900s. League of Nations didn't take because the US refused to get involved. It wanted to stay sovereign. So that project failed, but the United Nations then worked out better. And they got everyone to join, including the US. And then once the United Nations was set up, it was going to be a vehicle for world government, ultimately. And it could also roll out the mechanisms of pandemics through the WHO, which is UN, Agenda 21, and all these things. But just to really compress it, in the 1970s, the Club of Rome was set up. And that's kind of a super rich guys, influencers club for climate terror and propaganda. And they set up the IPCC ultimately. I think it was 89 or 91, but that's where they were ready enough to really put together a worldwide intergovernmental panel. You know, it was the right time. And that's when it really started getting going because they got scientists and scientists and scientists. There was no end of money. And of course, any scientist that questioned the hypothesis was simply discarded, funding gone. So they quickly learned there's no success here for me. And any scientists that would go along with it and catastrophize got funded hardcore and became much wealthier and more successful. So if you imagine that natural evolution from the 90s to today, like 30 years, over a generation of scientists with that selection pressure powerfully applied, big money go with the hypothesis, no money and ostracized and ridiculed if you don't. You end up with the so-called 97% of scientists agree. And even that, it's hilarious, Eddie, that 97% paper that I believe was funded by Obama, some Australian guy did it, that's actually total fraud. Because if you look at the scientists that actually agree that there is climate change, the temperature is man-made, and it's heading to a catastrophe, the real message of net zero, you're down to 1% or so, or 2%. But they included everyone who said, oh yeah, I've heard about climate change. So that's fraud. But here we are, and you're right, the cooling. In the 60s and 70s, I think there was a slight downtick in the temperature, and we had Leonard Nimoy did a big documentary, and we're going to all die in an ice age.
Dr. Spock, yeah.
Dr. Spock. Yeah. And then that happened for a few years, and then it kind of curled, and then they went with, the warming. And that one, because we naturally have a rising temperature, around 0.6 degrees in the last 50 years, approximately, less than a degree, they ran with that. And that one is sustainable as a narrative because technically the temperature is going up. But the modelling, it's comical when you see the modelling graphs. So when you look at around 50 modelling groups in climate, all funded to the hilt. There's loads of money to go around.
And they combine into the UN IPCC report, is it? Those 50?
They do.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so you got a 1,000-page report, but the summary from IPCC reports is very politically biased. But when you actually read the report, you find out the IPCC, in their most recent one, have said there is no evidence supporting any change in tornadoes or forest fires or any other climatic event. There's no change in those patterns. In fact, the 30s in America was a lot hotter and a lot more forest burning. So the IPCC kind of has to stick to the truth largely in the huge report. But then when you get the synopsis for the press...
Oh, the media, that's where it goes bananas, right?
That's where it goes bananas. That's where the scientists step back and let the politicians take over.
Do you know why? I find that quite interesting because I've asked a lot of people, have you ever read a UN IPCC report? Especially the zealots, and they haven't. But when you do, you see a lot of ifs and buts and high certainty, mid certainty, low certainty. You say that this model is based on a huge amount of moving parts. So I interviewed Dr. Judith Curry, you may have heard of her.
Yes.
Last year, and her book is an absolute revelation, and it's really worth studying. But what really jumped out at me, and I wanted to ask you about this, because I'm a bit history buff, And a year before the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, actually, destroyed the sweet spot in Islam, in 1258. In 1257, there was a very substantial volcano went off in Southeast Asia called Samalas. I'm just looking up my notes here, in a place called Lombok Island. And it was regarded as the largest volcanic explosion in about 10,000 years, or at least up there at the top. And it put a huge amount of stuff into the atmosphere, something like 40 cubic kilometers of dense rock went up into the atmosphere. And now they're saying it's contributed, but they're not saying it's entirely contributed. But the temperature then falls, especially in the northern hemisphere, for the next 500 years until around 1850, and then it starts to warm again. So we had a mini ice age caused not by CO2, but by a volcano, or certainly it would have contributed towards it. I mean, I found that in our book, and the most important thing I found was this idea that, I just have this here, I often use it, just a little coin, and I'll say, look, that is, no, I didn't know any of this until I read her book and did the study and talked to people like you, but that coin is, say, the Earth. And standing behind it is an orb something like 109 times bigger than the Earth. And we're being told by the UN IPCC models that glowing orb, which pulses and has cycles, is having a negligible, if no impact at all, on the atmosphere. Instead, what's causing it is us breathing, but CO2 itself, what percentage of the atmosphere is human-derived CO2? Do you know?
Well, the percentage at the moment is 400 parts per million, I think 0.04%.
Yeah.
So it's obviously tiny. And if you see the diagram for the amount of CO2 in a big block, it clearly is, it's just astonishingly small. The thing about CO2, we've gone from around 250 parts per million, I think, to around 420 now. 0.042. So it's still at a tiny level. And in the past, CO2 has been up at 2,000 parts per million, like 5 times more. And it doesn't correlate with temperatures over the millions of years, so does that. But it's a tiny amount. The problem is really that Arrhenius, the great physicist who I studied greatly in college, Arrhenius did hypothesize that the CO2 could have a greenhouse effect, a small effect, and it might help us not go into another ice age as quickly. So he saw it as maybe a good thing, but it's a tiny little help, Mammy's little helper. But the reality is that CO2, when you double it or nearly double it, it has a certain effect, which is tiny. If you double it again from 400 to 800 parts per million, if we did that in the next few decades, the effect on temperature is vastly smaller than the first doubling. It's logarithmic. So that graph alone, if you saw it, is just, to an engineer, I saw this in my first couple of hours, I said, hold on a minute, anything we'd get from CO2, which is tiny in temperature effect, it's now, we're not going to get any more, or it's going to be 10 times less. So in other words, there's no engineering problem. That's clear as crystal. But of course, that's just one other conflicting fact that will not be discussed. And this is the thing, the consensus, the science is settled. And Steve Koonin did a book. He was provost of Caltech. He was Obama's science head of administration. He's pretty much saying all this too. And it's hard to cancel him because he's such a huge figure. And he wrote the book Unsettled. But the whole thing has no basis. In my critical thinking class, and I'll finish with this, sorry Eddie, but I do a 3-hour online critical thinking class and I go through a lot of the engineering problem solving root cause stuff, but we use often climate change as an example and it comes out as a total rout because in the is not and in the evidence for against tools, when you actually catalogue all the facts, it's a slam dunk. I mean, it's crazy. And the CO2 one example of is not, I asked the audience online, well, what is climate change? Apparently, they say, and what is it not? Because we learn a lot from distinctions. And one of the things that comes up, well, it is CO2 and methane and cow farts. And they say, very good. What is it not? Apparently. And it's not melancholy cycles, it's not the sun, which is nearly everything, and it's not anything else. And I said, what we deduce from this, what it is and what it is not, and I write up fraud and political in capitals. Because the IPCC made a decision, a dictate many years ago, that they will only look at CO2 and methane. and anthropomorphic things. And I said, that is fraud, because in any problem-solving process, you always look at the full gamut of factors. And then you rack and stack them from the important ones with the biggest magnitude of effect down to the small ones. And at some point you cut it off and you don't bother. That would be CO2, by the way. And when you do that, you then look at addressable root cause. So in fairness, the biggest factor might not be addressable. So you might push it down, Pareto principle, but you go through the addressable ones. The problem here with climate change is the so-called addressable ones. Their effect is so small that you wrap up the team and you go home.
So, I mean, I suppose the conflict that people have in listening to a discussion like this is that they look out and they see, they see these zero carbon nut jobs, throwing paint on extraordinary works of art, blocking city centres, and then they look at their own political establishment in Ireland, which is almost like a hidden programme for government, which is the adoption of the UN Sustainable Development Goals in 2030. It's driving all our policy, and yet nobody is discussing it. In point of fact, if you look at the media, I don't know if you see this, but it's cut and paste between the New York Times, the Irish Times, and the Guardian.
Yeah.
And so we're in a cycle, or do you think we're in a cycle of similar type of propaganda that drove COVID? I mean, are there parallels there?
There are, only COVID was a kind of a short, sharp shock. And there was great advantage taken from that, obviously. Suddenly there's a pandemic, hasn't been 100 years. Everyone goes, oh my God, save Granny. Climate, remember, 1950s, it got going in earnest with Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the richest family in America, heavily connected into vastly richer banking families who also have an interest in managing the world. Hopefully for our benefit, but I don't think so. So it starts back then, and endless money, resources, ultra-rich individuals, NGOs in latter decades. This train has been coming down the track for 70 years. So people can just imagine how fraudulent the narrative will be after 70 years of funding by the biggest, kind of most influential players on the planet. So that might help people understand how this seems like crazy. 70 years of money and very, very well organized at a high level, kind of strategizing and planning makes for a pretty crazy universe. And that's where we are. And like I said, it's a key point worth reiterating, the 97%, that was achieved by them, and that is fraud. Because you simply put the scientists through an evolutionary process. People are familiar with natural selection, and that natural selection process has all the scientists agreeing, even if deep down they know it's nonsense, because the ones who stand up and say it's nonsense, poof, their career's gone.
And they don't get the funding.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's no way that we can hit zero carbon without creating poverty throughout the Western world, degrowth agenda. Yeah, we're barreling in that direction. And that's why I wanted to talk to you, because I found the media reaction to Trump in the UN was typically just full of tropes and personal insults and all of that, and not realising that this man represents the most powerful economy in the world. He's making an absolutely dramatic statement. He was saying that we're not buying this green hoax, as he calls it, from now on. So that means that the entire funding, the model that has the biggest, most powerful contributor to all that is pulling out. And and basically warning Europe and saying, look, you've got a serious problem here. But it wasn't the only thing that he said. So let's have a listen to what he also said, in this case about migration.
In the United States, we reject the idea that mass numbers of people from foreign lands can be permitted to travel halfway around the world, trample our borders, violate our sovereignty, cause unmitigated crime, and deplete our social safety net. We have reasserted that America belongs to the American people, and I encourage all countries to take their own stand in defense of their citizens as well. You have to do that because I see it. I'm not mentioning names. I see it, and I can call every single one of them out. You're destroying your countries. They're being destroyed. Europe is in serious trouble. They've been invaded by a force of illegal aliens like nobody's ever seen before. Illegal aliens are pouring into Europe. Nobody is ever, and nobody's doing anything to change it, to get them out. It's not sustainable. And because they choose to be politically correct, they're doing just absolutely nothing about it. And I have to say, I look at London, where you have a terrible mayor, terrible, terrible mayor. And it's been so changed, so changed. Now they want to go to Sharia law, but you're in a different country. You can't do that. Both the immigration and their suicidal energy ideas will be the death of Western Europe if something is not done immediately. This cannot be sustained.
Well, what's very interesting about that, Ivor, is that he's directly connected the flooding of Europe on the migration stuff, or on the illegal migration stuff. He's accused the UN of financing this, as well as the problem they had on their own southern border, and in the same breath, he's linking it to climate change. What did you think of that?
Yeah, well, the first thing that struck me, and I hadn't seen that clip, I'd seen the other one, was authenticity. So love him or hate him, but Trump there, from decades of managing people, he's authentic there. You can tell. You can just tell by his facial movements and everything. And he's correct. And he's correct to point to the UN, because just like climate, who's driving the mass migration? People would like to say, oh, it's just people have decided to come over here. It's not. It's the UN and their NGOs who are driving mass migration. And there's slide 5 here, actually, that I sent you earlier. I think you had a look at it. But this document, Replacement Migration, is the title. And it's the year 2000 from the UN, the Population Division. And basically, it lays it all out. Now, the narrative in this large document, it might be 50, 60 pages with references. The narrative is, oh, well, Europe birth rates have fallen and we won't be replacing our working age people enough, right? The problem with that narrative is the obvious thing to do would be to encourage birth rate. And you can do that with tax breaks. In Italy and Spain in the past, not 20 years ago, they were doing all that kind of stuff to encourage birth rates, etc. But they took a completely different view. And that's why it's called replacement migration, I think. It's bringing them in from internationally, not just moving within Europe. And their key conclusion, they had several conclusions, narrative supporting ones about economics, but it's nonsense if you look at the GDP impact over time of this mass migration illegal problem. Key conclusion, policies and programs relating to international migration, in particular replacement migration, and the integration of large numbers of migrants and their descendants. So the UN was basically given the nod from wherever, won't get into conspiracy theory, to start gearing up to flood the zone. And that's where all our politicians get their directions from, the EU, the Commission and the UN. I mean, they don't, I feel mostly, they don't really care about the voter anymore. Once they get enough votes for themselves, they're reporting to a higher power.
Now, one of those countries that is focused on improving the birth rate amongst the native population is Hungary, as I recall. So I'm going to play a little clip here of Viktor Orban earlier this year, making very interesting comments around migration, especially coming into his country. Have a listen to this.
I do remember how Mr. George Soros published his plan in English in a Project Syndicate publication. It was done 2015, September 26. And he published a plan. He said that I'm quoting, here are the 6 components of my comprehensive plan. I just quote 2 or 3 points of that. First is, he said very clearly, 2015, that, quoting again, EU has to accept at least 1 million asylum seekers annually. That was the first point. Second, he said, adequate financing is critical. And he proposed to issue long-term euro bonds for financing the migration crisis and the migrants' social and welfare taking care when they arrive to the European Union. And another point which is very important for Hungary, which is involving the territory of Hungary directly into this program, he said that, quoting them, safe channels must be established for asylum seekers, starting with getting them from Greece and Italy to their destination countries, which means to bring them to Greece, to Hungary, and then have them to go to Austria. So don't forget that what we are speaking about is not an accidental story. not the bulk of 10 years of accidental. So it's a plan.
So who is George Soros, and why is Viktor Orban concerned about his master plan?
Yeah, so Soros, he's kind of a villain, panto-villain. But yeah, Soros broke the Bank of England, I think, with his shenanigans a long time ago. It made billions and cracked the bank. And he is funding massively his open societies. Sounds nice, doesn't it?
This is an NGO, is it?
NGO, big one though, Open Societies Foundation. And it means what it says, but what Soros has been doing as well, pretty much on the record, funding local DAs in American cities to go soft on crime, soft on sentencing. And
That's district attorneys, just to get that.
Oh, sorry, district attorneys, who hold a lot of decision making. So the ultra wealthy who want to kind of rule the world in their own way, they know they can put the money where it matters with key opinion leaders or key positions, like legally, like district attorneys. So there's been chaos caused. We all know about the $900 limit in California. I think it's $900. You can steal up to $900 and you don't get a sentence. I mean, that is clearly designed to destroy society. So there's a massive assault. Soros is one of the biggest figures in it, but Soros is in, of course, with the UN, with the Rockefeller, with all the usual suspects, the Club of Rome, Bilderberg. There's no conspiracy theories here. There's just all these NGOs and organizations that all have a common view of the world and a common kind of desire to strategize to have a world government. And I view it really at its simplest, Eddie, to be quite honest, that they just want a big blob. So Peter Sutherland, our own Peter Sutherland, he's in Bilderberg, major figure, or was before he died, and himself and the rest of them, their whole plan was to flood the zone. And Sutherland in 2009, and also in a commission inquiry, I think in the UK, he was quite clear. He said, we need to get rid of this nationalism and sovereignty. You know, just like Micheál Martin said as well, we need to get rid of this outdated idea of sovereignty. So they want to destroy nationalism and sovereignty, because how do you get a big blob, right, of a global government unless you rule over a blob of people without much sense of nationhood, culture, history, or sovereignty? And essentially, Sutherland said it because he was correct. If you have the diversity of Ireland with its people and its culture, and the austere Swedes, you know, with their culture and history, and the Germanic people and the French with their cheese and wine, and they get to maintain that diversity, real diversity, by having these places everyone can visit and learn, you can't make that into a governable blob, because all those countries will say no to the crazy stuff, ironically, that's happening now. So there's a book many years ago by a socialist lady, actually, interestingly, Weapons of Mass Migration, which goes in great detail into this. There's no conspiracy theory here. It's an extremely powerful strategy to break down nationalism and sovereignty. That's what it is. And Soros in 2015, as Orban says, so we went through 2000 with replacement migration. That was the UN beginning its drive. And Soros came out in 15 and told the EU and the UN, well, what Victor said there, you got to start piling up money in bonds to pay for this.
Well, outside of Soros, I know that the UN has a subsidiary organisation, the International Organization on Migration,
IOM, big, powerful.
Tell us about those. Yeah, they're running on around $4 billion a year, and they have an office in Baggot Street in Dublin as well.
Yeah, they have offices all over. So the IOM is a massive wheel, and there are many other very large NGOs, but they're all working together. So I guess for Irish people, at Níon Ciro Gela, the old phrase, they all know each other and they know they have a common aim. So the NGOs are a massive problem, but the IOM is the heavy hitter, because it's got a umbilical cord pipeline for mega dollars straight into the UN, which is kind of the center of the spaceship that's running things.
So one of the things that you brought up, spaceships, one of the alien craft that has been hovering around the Irish atmosphere for the last number of years, and that is partially funded by Soros's foundation, is the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, the ISD, and they appear all over the place in the broadsheets, and especially with RTE, they would have been the lead fact checker, for example, on the concentration on Kulak that time over the IPAS Centre, and it's just quite extraordinary that the constant use of ISD by the so-called fourth estate, without declaring the fact that it's an NGO who's designed and paid for by the European Commission, by the British government, by the German government, by the Soros Foundation, by Google, as I recall, and whose job basically is to clamp down on what they regard as counter-narratives, but they're presented as fact-checkers. I find that very interesting, which brings us to Ireland, Ivor, because I've been looking at Ireland, scratching my head, saying Ireland doesn't have a system here. We're just bringing them in. We're lashing them into centres. There's no plan for assimilation or integration, and it would appear to me that I've grown up. When I say I'm quite grown up now, but for the last 30 years watching a great type of immigration coming into Ireland to help us to build the place. They were the Poles, they were the Filipinos, the Brazilians. Helped build Ireland, modern Ireland, and assimilated and integrated. But the type of immigration we're now talking about, which is the illegal immigration and where it's coming from, that seems to be a real problem. But before we get into talking about the problem, can you just bring us through what you see with regards to the dearth of data we do have in Ireland compared to, we'll get on to compared to where in a moment. But what do you see when you look at the Irish data?
Yeah, well, I just grabbed a few bits earlier on today. So slide 9, and by the way, this is from a Gript article, an excellent one in last year, I believe, so might link it. But this first slide here, you can see, well, where are they coming from? Because the story was, of course, Ukraine and war-torn areas over in Africa. But the reality is, in the Gript article, the overwhelming majority are not from anything to do with refugee status or war-torn. They're economic migrants. And in this graph, you can see here, Nigerian dominates, and the article itself says 31% of the total were from Nigeria, 9% from Bangladesh. So you're nearly talking about half from Nigeria and Bangladesh. So this has nothing to do with war-torn and nothing to do with refugee. I think, though, most people in Ireland now realise this is nothing to do with refugees. It's economic migrants. And we've gone through why it's happening. Probably quickly could go to slide 10. And I'll read it out. The table below shows the large majority of these occupying accommodation while claiming asylum are not, in fact, from war-torn countries. And again, you see the breakdown there with the harp on the top right. And we have some from Europe, yes, but Africa is the big hitter in the Pareto, and Asia then is the other one. So it's dominated by people who are economic migrants. And our politicians are clearly driving this agenda on behalf of their paymasters, if you will, above in the UN. I mean, this is what we're getting. The problems that it's causing and will cause are enormous. And again, I come from a position where I've mixed race people connected to my family. I have zero racism, and I'm on the record in public for the last 12 years and my whole life before it, zero racism. I simply have none of it in me. But this is not about racism to point out that we have a national security issue. We have a cultural erosion and destruction issue. We have a homeless and a problem with housing issue. This thing that they're doing on behalf, let's be clear, on behalf of non-Irish people, that is absolutely unequivocal, and we've talked around a bit of that.
Yeah, but what about Peter Sutherland, the chairman of Goldman Sachs, the head of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in 2012? You mentioned that earlier on. I mean, I expect that his position in Goldman Sachs was approved by the Bank for International Settlements in advance. I mean, this guy's a dyed-in-the-wool globalist. He mentored Klaus Schwab for 18 years before he passed away, and he would have been one of the architects of stakeholder capitalism, which is precisely what we've got in this country since the burst. What about him? He's Irish.
He is indeed Irish, but I neglected to say, Irish people who are not in the belly of the beast. So clearly, Sutherland, head of Goldman Sachs, I mean, that's head of the snake, and everyone knows that, it's the top of the banking hierarchy. And as you said, his roles in the UN, and he in Bilderberg with Coveney, it was his understudy in Bilderberg. Interesting gentleman there as well. But yeah, it's a different thing. They clearly have left behind totally Ireland, Irish sovereignty, Irish culture. The Irishness that's in them has been sold to internationalism and globalism. So you can't really count those as Irish people because they've made their choice, if you will.
Well, I mean, Hugh Coveney might have a thing to say about that, but we'll see. Or at least Simon Coveney. Sorry, Hugh Coveney was his father, God rest him. But but just moving on, right? So we get now to, like, when I look back on it and I see the type of immigration that we've had is been tremendously successful up until very recently, and it's the change. So it's not the people that helped us build the houses and build the motorways and run the restaurants and have integrated and assimilated into Irish culture, and we've been very proud of all of that. And as you said, it's a security issue. So let's just talk about that, because the type of immigration that has suddenly arisen on our shores, net of, our huge support for the Ukraine, which makes perfect sense, and that's part of a temporary directive in Europe. What's going on there? What are your findings?
Yeah, so, well, Ukraine was the moment where the floodgates were opened, and I think people should be or realise that. So our minister for, I guess people, I can't remember exactly, but Roderick
O'Gorman.
O'Gorman, yeah, hard to even remember his name. His department sent out a tweet saying, in Ukrainian, Ireland's open for business. Come on down, the price is right, you're going to get everything. Words to that effect in Ukrainian. But also that tweet was sent out at the same time in a bunch of African languages and Georgian, I believe, and other languages. So clearly under cover of Ukraine, we were going to open the doors of Troy. And that's what happened. You're absolutely right, Eddie. I have a couple of close relations who married into Polish families, another Eastern European. I had Romanian plasterers like Eli, great guys, completely pretty much blended in culturally, etc. Different, but blended in, intermarried, all good. What we have now is dramatically different, clearly. It's people with very powerful religious beliefs, very powerful cultural beliefs with respect to women and things of that nature. So there's dramatic cultural differences, and also we have already clearly ghettoization. So people are coming in who really are just sticking together totally, and they're not going to blend in any way like the previous decades. So that's, for people listening, it's a dramatically different migration. It's economic migrants, overwhelmingly unskilled, and long-term potential you could question as well, and non-integration, and no mass whatsoever for our culture, or saying, oh, Ireland's great, or any of that kind of American stuff. None of that. And I think people know that. And I've heard stories even from my kids' friends about going out to nightclubs in Dublin now is so dramatically different. Like single men who are clearly very different, with very different kind of ideals, stare. And often they're on their own, God bless them. I mean, they wander around, and in the IPAS centres, they wander around. They're generally on welfare. They're not so hireable or employable. It's just such a colossal problem. I don't know if I can overstate it.
So when did the surge happen then, when you looked at the data? Was it just within the last few years?
Primarily, yes. And there's a graph here, 11, we can show on the screen. And again, it's from a Gript article. Fair play to the guys. They saved me some work. But you can see there, I put a black line in February 2022. Like I mentioned about the tweets, we have this explosion. So that's kind of knee in the curve, exponential or beyond exponential for a while. That's when it really got crazy. And we don't have them here, but the figures for 23 and 24, it's all up and to the right, because the orders have been given, the trigger has occurred, and here we are, we're getting flooded.
But in that slide, that didn't include the huge numbers of Ukrainians.
That's the astonishing thing. And again, I trust Gript. They're very good on having their references. But yes, that graph does not include the huge number of Ukrainians. And I put it in red, who continue to arrive. So this was, I think, early last year, the article. So it doesn't even include the Ukrainians. But as we saw earlier, the Ukrainians are the least of it in any case. So it's mostly the countries I mentioned.
So can we just push on? I mean, the actual data that we have ourselves in Ireland isn't very well correlated. To ethnicity or background. There's some good data in Britain, but I mean, there's extraordinary data in one particular country, which we're getting to in Europe. But I mean, it seems to me that we don't have a system here. We just bring them in, put them in centres, and it'll all be all right in the night. Don't worry about it. And if you say anything at all, you're racist or you're far right or something. But for me, the whole thing is the most important thing we've got is a security problem more than anything else. I just want to get into that. So I think your next slide 12, is that from the Office of National Statistics in the UK?
Oh, that's ONS actually. Yeah, I just grabbed this one from somewhere. But the thing is, you can see there in terms of employability and whether people are unemployed or just on the dole, etc. You can see this marked difference between nationalities coming in, and there's pretty huge unemployment from a whole series of countries around the world. And it's just to make that point as well that the GDP, generally speaking, migrants coming in increase the GDP. They increase the flux of money, but in general, it should be skilled migrants, like you said before, like the Poles, the Romanians, all the people came in 20 years ago. So that just illustrates there's a mega unemployment problem on top of everything else. But if you want to get to kind of security, which I agree with you is probably one of the biggest issues, that's the next one, slide 14. And you asked, well, which country has its data together? It has more than its data together in Denmark because they have greatly reduced or mitigated or moderated the influx. They seem to be pretty smart about this. So they have great data on crime. Perhaps we'll touch on that first. In the top left and bottom left, we have crimes by country of origin. And you can see there native Danish people, they commit crimes in fairness, just like Irish people. Immigrants from Western countries are actually around the same statistically, if anything less. So it's not all immigration, but then you see non-Western countries immigration, and you see that the crime levels are vastly higher per capita. And I think on the right is a very interesting breakdown. This was Ryan Research, though I downloaded from the Danish website all the data myself, but he did the graphs. Thank you. Native Danes there on the right-hand side graph, Western immigrants, a little higher in crime, non-Western, much higher. But then on the far right, if you'll pardon the pun, we have the descendants of the immigrants, so their children. And the descendants of Western type immigrants are actually doing very well. Not so much the descendants of non-Western immigrants, where you can see there it's the highest bar of all. So this is very much as a major security issue for everyone in Ireland, the native Irish, because crime's going to be rising. And as you have double or triple the crime associated with these economic migrants, mostly from the third world, let's be honest, I'm not judging, and the numbers of said people are increasing explosively, you've got a double trouble. You got the much higher crime and the much higher numbers of what's generating the higher crime. So this is Ireland's future. Also, the birth rates of these people, as it happens, are way higher, and they're going to increasingly, utterly dwarf the birth rates of Irish people and even Western immigrants, I would guess. So now you've got a triple effect. Where is that going, Eddie? The people who are keeping their head down when they're accused of being racist, which is a nonsense slur at this stage, by the way, they're keeping their head down, but in the next 10 to 20 years. Some reports are saying Ireland or Irish people will be a minority by the 2040s. And after that, it keeps scaling with the birth rates. Where's it going? It's going into... We'll need a mega amount of security, and the people themselves will need more and more security as the years go by.
On current trajectory.
This trajectory,
the trajectory can be changed, but it may need a change of government to do it. I accept that. But what I find fascinating about the juxtaposition between Ireland, which is no model really, there's no system.
Nothing.
There's no system. And we're comparing it against a country. Okay, let's forget Denmark for a second. Sweden has been described as low-level civil war. France has huge problems in the area. Britain has big problems in the area because they were former empires and people have followed them back, which is understandable. But for me, Denmark really stands out because the whole Danish system seems to be built on data, not on opinion, data. And when you look at the data, you see that what have they done? It takes 8 years to become a citizen. But for 4 of those years, you cannot have been reliant on Danish social protection. They only take in 5,000 citizens a year. They clearly show the ethnicity of crime based on the current migrants that are coming in and their the generation before that, and then they stop. So and they produce the data. And what I say to people is, if you think all of this is kind of made up, you can actually go into the Danish CSO, which is called Danmark Statistik, And I might put a link at the end of the YouTube video, so people can do that. And you can translate it to English, and you can actually do your own research. It's all there. The information is there. But in Ireland, we're not even allowed to talk about this. And we have hate speech bills on the back burner, and when they come in, you could get arrested for talking about this. This is a security issue. It's quite clearly a security issue. And I just find it absolutely extraordinary that we're not talking about it more openly. Why do you think that is the case?
It is fear. And remember, the whole COVID nonsense was they use fear as the major mechanism. And the fear of war, I think I mentioned earlier, used to be used, but now it's not so good because of nuclear war, etc. Fear is always the key. Fear of climate disaster, fear of pandemics, fear of death. But the biggest fear of all, in many ways, so I believe I teach psychology as well quite a bit at times. The second fear after fear of death or grievous injury for humans, right, due to our chimp brain, it's a long story, is the fear of exclusion from the tribe. So people have a deep-seated fear of exclusion. And the guys running these games, the weapons of mass migration that are now deployed in the last few years with increasingly horrific effects over time, they know damn well how the human mind works. Remember that during COVID, the SAGE committee in England, 50, 60 experts, half of them were psychologists, right? So there's no accidents here. So they know that the racist slur or the anti-this or the anti-that or the phobia or the isms, they know it strikes terror into the hearts of the people. And that keeps people from talking. And if you can keep people from talking through fear mechanisms, which they're doing pretty well at so far, you can go ahead with your malign plans for those people. And that's what we have. Now, people, I think, are increasingly beginning to get this, and they're beginning to realize that the cowardice at being called something, a slur, is nothing compared to what their children's children will be or what will be inflicted upon them, and the loss of their culture, their nation, and everything. So I think we're getting there, albeit slowly, Eddie. It would be much better if people dropped the cowardice and woke up quicker. But I'll take what we have at the moment.
What jumped out at me in some of the stats that came up from the study was if you look at Sweden, for example, from 2000 to 2023, the increase in rape is 359%.
Yes. Now, there are some arguments that they changed the exact definition of some sexual crimes, and I'm not 100% sure, but broadly, we had a slide we didn't share here from one of the rape crisis type outfits, and they did a big report on this, and they did say, I think, and I quote from them, the African origin approximately 10 times the background rate per capita, and I think some of
10 times the native rate.
10 times per capita.
Per capita, the native rate.
That's important. Yeah. And they also mentioned Eastern European. A surprising figure to me was 7x, but they are from a report published, and I'll have to. I would have thought it would have been 5 or 6, but your point, of course, stands. Particularly these crimes related to disrespect for women, which we know is an enormous problem across much of the non-Western world, and it ain't racist or phobic to say that. People know how it is. In vast areas of the world. It's shocking. And you're importing that, you know? You can take the man from the bog, or what's that old phrase? Nothing racist about it. It's just a reality. It's cultural. Yeah,
we now seem to have reached a point where the government rhetoric is changing to accepting that we can't cope with the volume that have come in, whatever about the quality, which is what we're talking about just for the moment, but just purely the volume, and that because of a recent ruling by the European Court of Justice on a question put to it by the Irish High Court, we now have to compensate asylum seekers with money if we can't house them, and that's why there's no discussion of paying them a go away amount of money of €10,000 when they do come into Ireland. I mean, it's quite a mess, isn't it?
It's astonishing. And Sweden, I think 30 grand or more they're trying to give to their problem to get them to leave. So basically, our puppeticians obey the UN, allow weapons of mass migration to be literally deployed on our people and our country, and they soak up our coffers of taxes in paying for it, paying for the privilege, and then they soak up more tax trying to pay them to leave. I think any politician who's defending in any sense this picture we're painting here has not a shred of care for the Irish people. I mean, that's just a fact. There is no getting away from that. One quick point I'll have to say, Eddie, because you triggered me there a little. The 8 years for Denmark, that's not unique. Switzerland, where I've been quite a few trips to Switzerland, interesting, they are not suffering any of what we're talking about. Kind of ironic, or maybe appropriate, because Davos is there and Bilderberg, you know. So Switzerland protects its meat and farmers very well. In Ireland, we're destroying them. It's another agenda people are probably clearly aware of. And they have migration, but it's 7 years, I believe, in Switzerland. I don't know about the 4 years off social welfare. I guess in Switzerland, you got to be 0 years in social welfare, I would guess. You have 7 years, 8 years in Denmark. In Ireland, you have what? You have 0 years or minutes or seconds. The moment your foot touches the ground and your passport is in the dustbin, you know, somewhere back along the way of travel, that's it, you're in.
Yeah, can I just ask you one last question? Because it'll tee up my next episode, which is really to look at what's happening next door in the UK or up the road in Northern Ireland. And that's that they have a real problem now with hate speech, people being arrested. We saw that with Graham Linehan, the comedian, you know, which brought it to the fore. And now they're introducing the Brit Card, which is essentially biometric ID. You know, there's going to be a big backlash to it, I know. But I mean, what's interesting, I just want to throw this to you. One final question. Do you believe Keir Starmer and the Labour government in Britain, excuse me, sorry, bit of a cold, when they say that they're bringing in biometric ID, the Brit Card, in order to control illegal immigration? Do you believe that?
Even though I've been laughing about this for some days now, I have to laugh again. That was involuntary laughter. It's comical. So I think that many of the people like Starmer, and he's up to his neck in globalism and everything we've described, we know where it's coming from. I think many of them are genuinely laughing at us now. So to actually turn it around and give that as the excuse is a pantomime. It's comical. And I think more people are realizing it. The history of this digital ID card, I'll make no bones about it. If you get in digital ID, which is the precursor to programmable central bank digital currency, which is being pushed really hard, that's why it's vital they get the digital card. Tony Blair, back in I think 2011 or 12, did a massive push. Again, he's part of the head of the snake, obviously, the globalism, and his institutes are up to their neck in all the bad guys' stuff. But he tried to get it in and failed. Imagine back then, before people were woken up by the COVID nonsense, people stopped it. And now they're trying again because it's so important. But just as above, so below, it's so important to them. And likewise, it's so catastrophic for free people and free citizens. I can't overstate how dangerous digital ID cards are. And people say, oh, but we have a passport, we have a driver's license. Okay, then why do they need a digital ID card if we have those documents? You see, that's the point. They need the digital ID on the phone, that you must identify yourself increasingly wherever you go and whatever you do. And to your point, I think you mentioned this morning, they're linking it to climate already. So in other words, you go in and you want to buy meat. Oh, you've eaten too much meat this month. And all of this is possible. That's why it's the wet dream of the globalists, who are mostly sociopathic, in my mind. That's an opinion. The wet dream is digital ID, because now you've got the ants in your ideal ant farm locked down.
Well, I think we'll end on that point, actually. And I wanted to thank you for coming in, Ivor, because it seems to me that the axiom is that if you own an asset or you have a right to a service, and from now on, you can't get at your asset or the service without going through a digital ID program, you're being brought into the spider's web, into the digital gulag, into the trap. And that's why I think it's going to be fascinating to watch what's happening next door over the next number of weeks in the response from the British. They're slow to anger, but when they get going, if they cross over the threshold, as we saw with the poll tax, years ago, they're well capable of putting a run on the Labour government on this point. So it's going to be very interesting to see, because it's going to create an awful lot of nerves in Ireland, where they've hate speech bills lined up, ready to go, and they're watching what's happening with the Brit Card next door. Because if it comes into Northern Ireland, our gang are going to say, "Oh, we got to have a digital ID card in Ireland."
Absolutely. So there's 2.5 million signatures, one of the highest number ever collected the last few days in England for a debate. You only need 100k. It's up at 2.5 million. Very impressive. Gives us great hope. And what would I say?
This is a petition against the Brit Card.
A petition against the digital ID Brit Card. Yeah, absolutely. And it just as a further proof, and I'd just like to reiterate, I don't want to over-egg this pudding, but the accusations of racist with respect to any of this or the other anti ones, I scorn them. So I just want to let people know, you want to use that, I'm going to laugh at you. Because at this stage, it's such an obvious psyop, the use of those trigger words, that it has become a pantomime and comical. And you know what, Eddie? If you told me you were going to use weapons of mass migration in Ireland and you were going to move up a whole load of people from Cork into my neighbourhood, I'd be reacting just as I'm reacting here.
Well, you made me... You're after affecting my cold again, not for the first time tonight. Look, I just want to apologise to viewers for me stumbling around. It's just it's a bit stuck in the system. But that was a fascinating discussion, Ivor. I mean, we covered an awful lot of ground there with regards to, using the events, extraordinary events in the UN of Trump coming in and really, accusing the UN basically of being behind the illegal immigration into the United States and warning Europe that if you don't get your migration under control and you don't get your energy under control, if you don't do these things, and I mean the whole green agenda, you're going to destroy your countries, and that's why we've had the discussion. So thanks for doing that, and thanks for going through the detail. You know what to do. Firstly, thanks for listening to this extended episode of Counterpoint. Just hit the two big buttons, like and subscribe. And if you like this content, if this is the type of thing that will finally wake somebody up that is a nearly awake person, or I call an apps, please get this content out to them and let's start this discussion, because you can be absolutely certain that hate speech bill is coming, and behind it, if the Brit Card were to be successful in the UK, which I don't think it will, it's coming here as well. It's just around the corner. It's no longer an estimation. It's no longer a conspiracy theory. It's a reality, and it's happening up the road in Northern Ireland. Thank you.